absconded bail in Galveston. When he was arrested, they found a notebook in his car. Inside that notebook, one of the pages had the following: "What DD is doing to me puts me in the same place as what Kathie did to me." Now, the evidence is going to demonstrate that DD is Douglas Durst. And the place that DD is putting him in, the defendant himself, when he is in custody, is going to be talking on the phone approximately, I can't remember if it's a couple of weeks later, in fact. Yeah. So on December 14th, he's going to have a phone conversation. That conversation is going to be with his wife. And during that call, he is going to be discussing how he was feeling about Douglas Durst. And this evidence is being admitted to demonstrate, to connect, that when he said that it was putting him in a place, what Kathie did to me, that place was homicide. And he's going to explain it in his own words.
And you know what I told you the other day about just when we were talking, what I said I thought you were going to do? Remember?
No.
We were talking, you were telling me about what your life has been like and what you were thinking.
Yeah, my plans, yeah.
Okay.
You're definitely not going to say it.
Okay, but you told me what your plans were, well, and I told you that I knew, I had a feeling, I suspected. Remember?
You know, I totally screwed it up, didn't I?
Oh, never mind that. But if I suspected, he too suspected. What I'm trying to say. Didn't really focus on it.
Well, something I think I left this out. Did I tell you that I went to his house while I was in Danbury?
I think I read that you did, but I don't remember if you told me.
You read somebody. I mean, I think I told these, you know, Mike Kennedy types. I was driving around these places. I grew up, my family places.
Oh, it was in the newspaper then?
Yeah, but I really went. The next time we have a visiting day, I'll go over it with you.
I'd like to hear it, but...
I sort of left that out.
Okay, but I just want you to know that, remember what I told you I thought you were going to do? He knew it too. Keep that in mind.
I think that if he was concerned about that, he wouldn't have treated me so bad.
I disagree.
What?
I don't agree with you. Treating you so
Maybe he
bad.
thought I would screw it up like I did. Maybe he's right. I guess he is right then. If you're right...
Remember that if I knew it, he knew it. That's my point.
Now, the evidence is going to show that Douglas Durst was living in Katona. That's a small town near, actually, South Salem, where Kathie and Bob Durst were living in the lakeside cottage. The evidence is going to further show that this conversation, that Mr. Durst was discussing the fact that he had screwed up his plan to kill Douglas. And in fact, he's going to expand upon that in another call that's going to take place with his wife a little over a week later. He is going to refer to something called egoring. Evidence is going to be put on this case that refers to the defendant's dogs, Igor. He's had several dogs. I want to make clear, in the movie All Good Things, there were allegations that Mr. Durst had killed his dogs, many of which he named Igor. In fact, the evidence is actually going to show that wasn't true. Evidence is going to show Bob Durst loved his dogs very much. And in fact, when he was watching the Jinx, as you'll remember, and when I spoke to him in New Orleans, what he ended up saying was, he ended up being very clear. He interrupted Mr. Jarecki and said the thing that really bothered him about the movie, he ends up saying, "How could you think I could do something to Igor?" Now, the evidence will show that Mr. Durst never made such responses, never complained about the fact that the movie depicted him as murdering 3 people. Now, in this next clip, he is going to refer again to his brother Douglas, but he's not going to do so by name.
From way back when, I was planning on Igoring DM.
Yes, I know.
So that was a good time of getting married. Because I was afraid that what happened to me just now, you know, would happen back then.
Can I ask you how you brought that up? Don't you think he knew you so?
I don't think he knew what I, Igor.
Yeah, I think he did because I do. So I think.
Oh no, he don't know me like that. Maybe now he suspects that maybe or something. I don't know. This is just so. I suspect he doesn't even suspect now.
Now remember, at the time that they're having this conversation, it has now been publicly aired that Mr. Durst has been charged with murdering and dismembering Morris Black. So the evidence is going to show that when Mr. Durst says that, quote, he don't know me like that, maybe he does now, what he's referring to is the fact that now his brother Douglas has information, has evidence that in fact he's killer. Now, a little later in the same conversation, if you picked up on it, he referred to Douglas Durst as BM. The evidence is going to show that BM is again Douglas Durst, and he's going to connect it up in the next call by discussing how he would need this BM to testify, in essence, about their upbringing.
For me to explain or let the jury know what a terrible life I've had, the way to do it is to get BM to testify.
Now, yeah.
What?
It's like an incredible mistake.
I can't. I could get BM and I could get the other people who watched him being, during those days,
Right.
and have them all testify.
Now, years later, when Mr. Durst was interviewed by Jarecki and Smerling in 2012, during the last interview, he completely denied this entire incident.
Actually have a dog question. I think I don't know if this was Kingdom Kaiser or the tapes or whatever, but somebody said that when you and Deborah were talking on the phone, that you guys had a code when you were in prison, and that she talked about, or you talked about, Igor and your brother. Well, I was thinking about Igor and him, and then at another time you said something about Sam. I was going to Sam that person and Igor that person. So I would just want to ask you that. I don't know that it's.
I was going to Igor, my brother, or Sammy, my brother. I know you didn't do anything about that.
Now, the evidence is going to demonstrate that in this case, not only do many of the most damaging pieces of evidence come directly from the defendant, but he doesn't remember what he has said and who he has said it to. Now, this information with his brother Douglas becomes very important. And this is why, and I want to now fast forward to something I was talking about on Thursday. This is how did law enforcement in Los Angeles become involved in this case. Detective George Shanley is going to testify in this case. Detective George Shanley, who's seated right over there, is the lead investigator in this case. He works for the Los Angeles Police Department's robbery and homicide. And when Detective Coulter retired in approximately November of 2012, Detective Shanley was given the case. On December 19, 2012, Detective Shanley is going to testify that he met with FBI agents in Los Angeles. One of those FBI agents was an individual named Eric Perry from New York. Detective Shanley is going to tell you that Eric Perry became involved in this case. You're also likely going to hear from Eric Perry as well. The evidence is going to show that Eric Perry became involved in this case when Douglas Durst, security chief, made a complaint to the FBI because Douglas Durst was afraid that Bob Durst was going to kill him. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is this contact occurred with Detective Shanley before Detective Shanley ever knew who Andrew Jarecki was, who Mark Smerling was, anything about All Good Things or the Jakes. Detective Shanley is going to tell you that he ended up getting this information. He's going to tell you that as the lead investigator on the case, he controls the investigation. He makes the decisions. But he's going to tell you that it is very common, almost routine, that especially on significant cases, detectives from his office will call representatives from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, particularly from our Major Crimes Division, of which Detective Shanley will tell you I was a member, and to discuss what's going to be done on cases. Now, Detective Shanley is going to also tell you that before he ever had any contact with me, the first thing he did after being contacted by the FBI was they were interested in exhuming Susan Berman's body for looking for evidence. Could there be DNA under her fingernails? Detective Shanley is going to tell you that the first thing he did was he contacted the funeral home. And in essence, he's going to tell you, he was told, you know what, when we got the body, we thoroughly cleaned under the nails, cleaned the body completely, so that DNA, if there were any, Detective Shanley is going to tell you, not going to be there. But Detective Shanley is going to tell you he did other things as well. He next contacted a criminalist at LAPD's SID division. And they're the people that basically test for DNA, etc. He went over the information he'd been given, and he was told by the criminalist from the lab, you know what, yeah, if that's what they've done with the body, you're not going to get any DNA. Now, Detective Shanley is also going to tell you that he did not speak to me until January 23rd, 2013. This is after he had already received this information, and he's going to tell you again that as a detective, on cases like this, you call the district attorney's office because in the end, although they do the investigation, we're the ones that decide to file the case. Detective Shanley is going to tell you that he discussed the case with me and that I gave him my advice on what I would recommend. Detective Shanley is going to tell you that in the end, he's the investigator. He makes decisions, and he made the decision in this case based on all the information he's been told that it did not make sense to exhume Susan's body for DNA because, one, she'd been shot in the back of the head with no signs of a struggle, and two, her body had been processed and cleaned in a manner that you weren't going to get any DNA, and that if you did, it was likely going to be what we call transfer, and an artifact, meaning that it's from people handling the body not related to the crime. So, the evidence is also going to show that eventually Detective Shanley did have contact with Jarecki and Smerling. However, they are not the ones that instituted this case being investigated. That was done by the FBI and by LAPD, Detective Shanley and other members of Robbery Homicide Division. So now I'm going to go to where we were. Let me switch this out here. Hey Tim, can you help me? I closed it. For some reason you can't see it on the computer. I can only see it up there and I closed the wrong file. Sorry about that. Just, if you guys are counting, we started with like 7 of these, and they were full. This is all that's left. And while he is setting that up, I just want to emphasize that because of the way this case is going to be shown with the witnesses, etc., that this is really the only chance that I have to give you guys a clear idea of what you're going to see. And so I want to make sure that for you guys to be able to do your job, that I make sure I do mine. So that's why it's been so lengthy. All right, let's talk about, so we were saying that, back up a couple of slides here. So on October 31, 2013, Detective Shanley is going to testify that he went through, he and I went through the evidence and we found this envelope. And the evidence will further show that this is actually the envelope. You can see November 14, 2000, the postmark. That is the postmark for one of the $25,000 checks that Bob Durst said that he sent to Susan. And we're also going to show you the check that we have back from the bank that corroborates it. I think I actually showed that during the opening previously. But so, the envelope, it turned out, was still there. Obviously, as you can see, it was addressed to Susan, and although some of it was in cursive and some of it was in print, what was important is that the 1527 Benedict, at top is the Cadaver note, and at the bottom is the October 2013. Well, that's not good. All right, in 2014, LAPD retained two world-renowned forensic document examiners, Lloyd, Cunningham, and Lynne. And they were brought in to compare Durst's handwriting to the Cadaver note and envelope. Now, this information was not revealed to Bob Durst. So at this point in time, he has no idea this is going on. He is, the evidence will show, he's not in custody. He's out living his life. So he doesn't know this is happening. Now, Lloyd Cunningham and Lynne concluded that Bob Durst wrote the Cadaver note. So they came back and said there are different opinions they can give, which Detective Shanley will discuss. The highest rating they can give is that it is their opinion that this was, in fact, written by the individual, and that person was Bob Durst. So, on October 15, 2014, Jarecki emailed Durst and his lawyer, Steve Rabinowitz, informing them that the documentary had been sold and would be airing on HBO. So, this is the first time Bob Durst is now notified through his attorney, and he's copied on this as well, that you know what, there's going to be not only a show based on the video, but that it's going to be on HBO. On February 8, 2015, the first episode of the 6-part documentary series, The Jinx, premiered on HBO. And let me emphasize again, The Jinx itself was heavily edited. You will not be seeing anything from The Jinx. You will only be seeing the interviews that were originally the source, which were then edited and put into The Jinx. But in any event, this premieres on February 8, 2015. The evidence will show that this was a major event and generated an incredible amount of publicity. That becomes important because the defendant knows what's going on, and he knows what's going to happen later on, or has a good idea in The Jinx, because he's aware of the confrontation from April 18, 2012. Now, the episodes aired every Sunday night, the conclusion on March 15, 2015. What's important is that it wasn't until the 5th episode, which aired on March 8th, the evidence will show, that the defendant became aware that Sarah Kaufman had been cooperating with the producers. Now, on March 8, 2015, that episode airs. Got ahead of myself here. Durst watched the episode live from his residence in Texas. Now, how do we know that? Because Sheriff Kaufman is going to testify that immediately upon the conclusion of that episode, Bob Durst calls him freaked out and in a panic. Sheriff's going to testify that Durst was furious that Sarah had given the filmmakers and not him, Durst, the letter. Now, at the time, Durst was living at the Robin Hood luxury condominium complex in Houston. On March 10, 2015, 2 days after the episode aired, this is surveillance video of Bob Durst leaving the condominium at 12:40 p.m. He was never to return. On March 11th, 2015, again, the next day, detectives, not the district attorney's office, detectives from LAPD obtained an arrest warrant from a Superior Court judge, meaning that they had probable cause to arrest him for Susan Berman's murder. Investigators then traveled to Houston, and these are RHD detectives, LAPD detectives, a group of them. They traveled to Houston, and they went there with the intent to arrest Bob Durst and take him into custody. At this point, there is no case that has been filed against Mr. Durst by the district attorney's office. There's an arrest warrant, which LAPD got on their own, but the district attorney's office has not filed a case. Now, by the time detectives arrive, remember, we're giving you the information right now, kind of in hindsight. So you know information the detectives didn't know at the time. So you know, because you've just seen it, that Bob Durst is going to flee the Robin Hood apartment. But detectives don't know that. They'll find out all this later during their investigation. And by the time they get there, he's already fled the city. On March 14, 2015, with the aid of the FBI, investigators determined that Durst was making phone calls from a payphone at the JW Marriott in New Orleans. Now, the evidence is going to show that in an unusual kind of result of this case, Bob Durst is going to do the same thing and make the same mistake that he did at the phone booth in Garbersville when he was driving down to murder Susan. Even though he's not going to be using his cell phone, he's going to call his voicemail to check for messages. That's how they ended up connecting with the phone booth in Garbersville, and the FBI ends up connecting him and learning that he is at that payphone at the Marriott in New Orleans. Two FBI agents, William Williams, it should have been, we left the S off, who goes by Chuck, and Crystal Bender quickly respond to the JW Marriott. At the time, Special Agent Williams is going to tell you he had his, I think it was a Ford F-150 truck in about 300 pieces. He wasn't planning on working that day. He quickly grabs on, gets on a suit, and he and Crystal Bender head down there. There are only two of them, and you're going to hear evidence that the JW Marriott is a very large hotel in New Orleans. So when they arrive, they actually see in the lobby of the hotel, there's a person they believe is Bob Durst. So they approach him. Special Agent Williams will testify that he repeatedly called out Mr. Durst, but the individual, who will later be identified as Bob Durst, would not respond, would not acknowledge his name. FBI agents identify themselves, and they detain Durst in the lobby. They are detaining him pursuant to that arrest warrant from Los Angeles. They're not arresting him for anything that they're investigating. They're, in essence, responding to this warrant and taking him into custody. Now, Durst eventually tells the agent that he checked into the hotel under the name Everett Ward. Now, Everett Ward, the evidence is going to show, is actually a name of a person going way back to Galveston who had purchased a bandsaw from Chalmers, a bow saw, from Chalmers. He was completely uninvolved in the case. He was just another person who had purchased a saw, but his report had been given in discovery. And the evidence will show that Bob Durst gets names, he gets addresses, he gets social security numbers, and he uses them. So he was using Everett Ward from an incident that occurred 14 years prior. Now, investigators would ultimately identify and search the hotel room at the Marriott where Durst was staying. Inside the room, they would find the following: a falsified text identification card with Durst's photo, but with the name Everett Ward. So the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst had a phony ID made using his picture and information about Everett Ward. They also found his true passport. They found a map of Florida and Cuba. They found $44,631 in cash. They found this expensive lifelike latex mask. So this is a mask that literally goes over and allows you, they're not cheap, it allows you to basically become somebody else. And finally, they found a loaded .38 caliber revolver. Now the next day, on Sunday, March 15th, myself and detectives interviewed Bob Durst. That's the March 15, 2015 interview. Now, just for you to know, the evidence is going to show, Mr. Durst was not forced to have that interview. He could have said, I don't want to talk. I'm not interested in speaking with you. But he agreed to the interview, and the evidence is going to show that he made some very damaging admissions. Now, before starting the interview, Mr. Durst was given blanket, a coffee, and advice of his Miranda rights. You're going to hear that entire interview with the exception of some edits that the court has made. What that interview is going to show is that the tone of that interview was non-confrontational, it was conversational, and that in fact, it was so conversational that Mr. Durst forgot who he was talking to and why he was there. And he ended up making damaging admissions. Now, it's also going to be clear that Mr. Durst could have ended this interview at any time. He has a right, as everybody says, to say, you know what, I don't want to talk anymore. But he didn't. Instead, he was interviewed for nearly 3 hours. And during that interview, the evidence will show that Bob Durst essentially made what the evidence will show was a confession to Susan's murder.
Do you want me to tell you a little about what I do and who I am?
I really want to talk to me about it. It's more pleasant in here than out there.
So, Bob Durst is very clear why he did the interview. He says, you know what? It's more pleasant in here than out there. The evidence is going to show in this case that repeatedly Mr. Durst is going to make decisions that were not necessarily smart. However, the evidence will also show that those decisions were his decisions to make, and that he voluntarily made them.
And what really kind of caught me was that most people, when they're talking to anybody, I mean, police, family, etc., most people are very much concerned with what other people think of them. And so what will happen is that they'll kind of make themselves out to be nicer, better, etc. And I noticed that with about 90% of the things you're asked, you are brutally honest. I mean, more honest than most people that I've seen, for 90%. But I'm wondering, is that something you're aware of about yourself in comparison to other people, or no? I mean, is that something, am I pointing out something that you've ever thought about or was aware of, or no?
More or less, I'm certainly aware of it.
Now, during the interview, he was confronted with the fact that despite his typical willingness to talk, that he seemed very reluctant in many interviews that he had previously done to talk about Susan. He would talk about Morris, he would talk about Kathie, but he would not talk about Susan.
Because I noticed it was very funny, interesting. When all the interviews in marketing entered, there was one person that you seemed the least comfortable talking about. Do you know who that was?
Kathie.
Susan.
Susan Berman, yeah.
You would talk about Kathie, you would talk about Morris, but you didn't want to talk about Kathie. And I was concerned that if you found out that I was looking at this case,
Yeah, I would have backed off, going to Cuba, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Who knows what?
So, Mr. Durst, during that conversation, honestly tells me, yeah, if I would have known you were looking at this case, I would have been in Cuba. By the way, you saw the map that he had. Evidence is going to demonstrate that Bob Durst was on his way out of the country when he was arrested. Now, the subject of Susan's murder continued during this interview with the defendant.
I'm gonna lay my cards on the table. I'm here talking to you today because I truly believe, Bob, I don't think you feel that badly about Morris. That's my view. I don't think you feel badly about Morris. I don't know how you feel about Kathie, but here's what I do know. I know that when you killed Susan, that was not something you wanted to do. Do you know how I know that? I mean, are you interested in why I know that?
I'm going to stay away from killing Susan.
So Mr. Durst's answer is not, I didn't kill Susan. Why are you accusing me of that? His answer was, I'm going to stay away from killing Susan, which the evidence is going to show is not a denial, it's an admission. Now, Durst admitted during the conversation that the only evidence that Kathie ever got on the train was his statement.
So you would agree that the only evidence of her getting on the train is you, right?
Right.
He also, during the interview, made a couple of shocking admissions.
I'm going to just ask this straight out. If you had killed Kathie, would you tell me?
No.
So Mr. Durst was honest enough to ask, hey, listen, if you killed Kathie, would you tell me? He says, no. He was asked a related question.
If you had killed Susan, would you tell me?
Now, during the interview, he discussed the thing that really bothered him about all good things. And again, it's not going to end up being the allegation that he's responsible for the murder of 3 people.
All good things, you agree, present you as somebody who's responsible for 3 murders, right?
Right.
Plus something else that really bothered you. What was the thing that bothered you most about all good things? When you said it to Andrew.
I'm killing all the dogs.
Now, the evidence is going to show that if somebody is accused of murdering 3 people and a dog, and their response is to focus only on the fact that they're upset about the killing of the dog, that the reasonable inference, what the evidence is going to show, is that that means the allegations of the murders are true. Now, the interview went on to discuss Durst's love of dogs.
Okay, so, by the way, are you a dog person, right? I have a dog. I'm very much into my dog. If you go into my, it's very funny. Well, it's not funny, but believe it or not, in me working on this case, I have young kids, and my daughter was afraid. She said, "Hey, is he going to hurt us?" I said, "No, he's not going to hurt you." And then she said, "Is there any way that he's going to hurt our dog?" And I said, "You know what? There's one thing about Bob that I'm very confident of. Bob loves dogs. Bob would never hurt a dog."
You're right. I appreciate it.
You like dogs, I think, much more than people. Is that right?
Yes.
Now again, the evidence will show that this was another opportunity for Bob Durst to say, listen, I didn't kill anybody. How can you accuse me of murder? I didn't do it. It's not what happened. Now during the interview, Durst was presented with the idea that he doesn't kill because he enjoys killing. And let me back up for a second. There's media out there saying all kinds of crazy things. What the evidence can show in this case is that although the murders that Bob Durst committed are horrible, they're not crazy, and they're not the signs of a deranged individual. What the evidence will show is that Bob Durst killed Kathie Durst in the midst of a nasty divorce. That he killed Susan Berman because he was afraid that Susan Berman was going to reveal what he knew. Now, the evidence will show that's not crazy. In fact, it was absolutely accurate. But what the evidence will also show is that Bob Durst killed her about 20 years too late because unbeknownst to him, she had already told her story to the numerous individuals that we've already presented. Morris Black and living in Galveston as a woman, again, this is not some crazy guy. This is somebody who's hiding, who thinks he's about to be charged, and Morris Black knew who he was able to connect him to his name and to New York. They were having issues and arguing about where Morris was going to live, and in the end, Bob Durst eliminated a problem. Cruel, illegal, immoral, homicidal, but not crazy. And again, when he was presented with this idea that he doesn't kill because he enjoys killing, he did not deny the allegation.
I told my daughter, listen, Bob is somebody who, Bob doesn't kill because he enjoys killing.
That's what Cody Gonzalez says. If you back him into a corner, he'll kill you.
So Bob Durst, on his own, is repeating what a detective from Texas said about him. So, you heard the statement. I'm explaining, Bob, you're not somebody who kills because you enjoy killing. And he tells you, you back me into a corner, and I'll kill you. That's essentially what he is saying. He's repeating what Detective Casula says, but he's not saying that's wrong. He's not saying that's inaccurate. He's the one bringing it up. Now, Durst was again confronted with the idea that whoever wrote the Cadaver note, whoever that person was involved in Susan's murder. Now remember, and this is very important, at the time this is happening, Mr. Durst has not admitted that he wrote the Cadaver note.
First of all, you agree, as you sit here today, you agree that whoever wrote that letter, they killed Susan. Agreed?
You see, I don't know that. I mean, maybe there were two people who killed Susan. It doesn't have to be one person. There could be two people. One person could go into the house to shoot Susan, and the other person could be the driver.
Okay, no, let me, this is what I mean. Whether the person was the shooter or the driver, whoever wrote the note was a part of killing her.
Yes.
Well, you agree, right?
Yes.
No question, right?
Whoever wrote that note had to be involved in Susan's death.
As you listen, what the evidence could demonstrate is that was not kind of a casual response that Mr. Durst didn't know what was being stated. He reiterated, absolutely, he clarified, whoever wrote that note had to be involved in Susan's death. Now, at this point in the interview, Durst was asked, hey, how are you being treated?
From what you can tell, does it seem like I've been pretty honest with you and pretty fair?
I don't know if we heard his response, he might have cut off. His response was yes, which you will hear in this whole interview.
Hey, by the way, better talking to us, right, than being out there. You have in mind to have this conversation with us.
I haven't minded. Excuse me at all.
Have you caught me any lies today during our conversation? Have you seen any lies that I've said to you about anything?
No, I'm not aware of any.
Now, what the evidence is going to show is that Bob Durst's favorite subject in the world is Bob Durst. And that anybody who knows a lot about Bob Durst, he wants to talk to. So the evidence will clearly demonstrate that when the detectives and you're going to hear from the detectives, they're going to tell you that we didn't fly out there to engage Bob Durst in casual conversation. We went out there to interview him and to see what he was going to tell us. But the evidence is going to show, beyond any debate, beyond any dispute, that Mr. Durst, as is his pattern, as it was with Andrew Jarecki in 2010, in 2012, over the phone, and with myself and detectives in New Orleans, Bob Durst likes to talk. He likes to talk about Bob Durst. And when he does, he makes mistakes. Now, at the end of the interview, Durst, in essence, confessed to Kathie and Susan's murders by admitting that he had details that he had not yet provided. So as you're listening, what the evidence will show is that Mr. Durst is being pressed to tell the truth, to say what he knows. Mr. Durst's response is not going to be, how can I tell you anything? I don't know anything. I'm not involved in this. That's not what he's going to say. He's going to give an answer that only somebody who is responsible, who knows what happened, would respond that way.
I would like to talk to you when you come back in court today. That's going to be up to you what you do. I don't know whether there'll be a lawyer there today. I don't know what that lawyer is going to tell you.
If he's going to tell me to shut my mouth, of course.
And this one I'll tell you, you have every right to listen to your lawyer and to do what your lawyer says. I think you know that you've already told me, you've talked enough. I have enough now. What I want to talk about when we get back is I want to find out what is it that we can discuss where I can get the truth about some of the things that you've said you couldn't really answer for me. But you have told me, correct, that there is, you know what I want, correct?
Yes, you'd like some details from me if I knew about where Kathie's body is.
And about what happened to Susan.
And about what happened to Susan.
And you would agree that you're in the position, if you want, to tell me more than you have.
So about that, I'm not about to go that far.
Okay. But wait a minute, because you're telling me, though, that I want to understand what you're saying. Tell me what
Well, you asked me what I thought you wanted to hear. I think what you wanted to hear to make Ann McCormack happy is what did you do with Kathie?
Right.
And I think you want me to go through details of Susan.
I do.
Okay, so now, what would I ask for?
Tell me.
If I tell you those things, I'm pleading guilty.
Okay.
And I'm pleading guilty. I'm going to be going back to Los Angeles, to California, and doing my time.
Now that exchange, the evidence will show, is crucially important because Bob Durst was admitting that he had the answers to those questions. Answers he could only have if, in fact, he was the killer. Now, the next day, on March 16, 2015, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed special circumstance murder charges against Bob Durst. Judge Wyndham previously read to you the complaint. The only difference, you see a complaint here? A complaint is what is filed when someone is arrested. After they have a preliminary hearing, they are rearranged with what's called an information. In this case, the information and the complaint are either identical or essentially identical. Now, with Durst in custody and unable to flee, the investigation continued. Now, Detective Shanley is going to tell you that between January 2013 and March of 2015, he faced a real dilemma. Because on the one hand, he wanted to go out and he wanted to interview as many witnesses relating to Kathie, Susan, and Morris as he could. But he's also going to tell you that he knew that Bob Durst was out of custody. He is out loose with millions and millions of dollars. and that if Bob Durst hears that in fact he is reinvestigating this case, Bob Durst is likely to flee the country, to go to Cuba. The very thing Bob Durst discussed in the interview. So, with that in mind, Detective Shanley is going to tell you that prior to Mr. Durst's arrest, he had to be very careful in terms of who was contacted. And Detective Shanley is going to tell you, and you're going to see it and you're going to hear it, that Mr. Bailey and I had significant involvement in this investigation. Because we were the prosecutors on this case, if the case got filed. We participated, Detective Shanley is going to tell you, in these interviews. Oftentimes, the voice you're going to hear most are going to be Deputy District Attorney Bailey or myself. And Detective Shanley is going to tell you, and you're not going to hear from one other person otherwise, that there is nothing improper or illegal or unethical about that. Now, so with Durst in custody and unable to flee, the investigation continued. And at this point in time, there was somebody that Detective Shanley had wanted to speak to. At the top of the list was Nick Chabin, who was Durst's extremely close friend, and also extremely close to Susan. You know, this is a good place to stop if you want.
All right.
Everybody's like, Coronas. You know it? Like, so I'm like, no.
That's it.
That's it.